So I'd like to offer some thoughts on the Eightfold Path, or thoughts that are inspired by the Eightfold Path. And I was reflecting that in all the years that I've been practicing, this is probably one of the things that I heard first of all when I first started studying the Buddha's teachings, you know, the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. This is very often where you would begin. And over the years, I've found it really helpful to keep coming back to it. And I wonder if, in a way, this is a way in for all of us to see it as a framework for our own reflections. So, in a way, then, the talk that I'm offering is to really support you in continuing to think about what does the Eightfold Path mean for you. So for some people this might be the first time you've heard a talk on this, others probably many times. But if you have them as questions that you live with, I think it's really skillful. So for instance, you know, some of the elements of the path will be right or wise speech, right or wise action. So rather than thinking, oh, that's an answer, you know, right speech is, great, I've got it. But more that we live with the question, you know, what is right speech? What is wise speech in this situation? And I think that one immediately makes me think, oh, that's a lifelong practice for us. And I've found over the years of thinking about this teaching that some of the things are the same, but some of the things change, and I come to a different understanding or different emphasis of some of these. But let's explore them together and see. So all of these 8 elements are, the word that comes before them is translated as right or wise or appropriate. And interesting, again, you can think about the different senses of those. So right is very often the term that you see in many, many translations, you know, right view, right intention, right speech. Many contemporary teachers have used the word wise, which I suspect is slightly less literally the translation, but gives more of a feeling of, you know, the heart of it, and less of a feeling of right, meaning this is absolutely right, this is absolutely wrong under all conditions, something a bit more flexible or fluid. And the word appropriate, I think, takes that further still and really emphasizing the context, you know, the importance of the context, what's appropriate in this context, rather than something that is kind of fixed once and for all. So the first of these is, you know, you'll probably hear me say right or wise, but right or wise view or understanding. So how we see the world, how we understand things. And this is often spoken of in relation to suffering and the end of suffering, the 4 ennobling truths. So part of this right or wise understanding is really looking very deeply into the nature of struggle in our lives. And as I mentioned this morning, there's very often a distinction made between the inevitable pains of life and the additional extra suffering created by reactivity. So we have that as a basic framework. But to reflect on these inevitable pains to begin with, the Buddha uses this phrase, you know, not getting what you want is dukkha, unsatisfactoriness and suffering. Yeah? Getting what you don't want is dukkha. And one of the things I love about that way of phrasing it is that it's so general, so universal, that it applies to everybody. It's not about, you know, some people have this, some people don't, but there's something written into the nature of human existence that means we don't always get what we want, and we get what we don't want. Yeah? So this is a very fundamental feature of life that we are faced with, And it's written into things because we're not in complete control. None of us. It doesn't matter how rich or famous or wealthy you are, you can't ultimately control the weather. Yeah? For instance, you certainly can't stop your body getting older. Can't completely control other people. I don't know if you found this, but one thing I notice in my life is other people inconveniently have their own moods and feelings, ideas on things, which is sometimes, not the same as mine, which is tough. Yeah. So the idea here, though, is to see that this is a really basic, fundamental feature of existence. It's not accidental. What I mean by that is it's not going to be different next month. It's not that, this month I'm not in complete control of all experience and I don't always get what I want, but maybe next month it'll be different. No, this is kind of how it is. And alongside those other fundamental truths of getting older, being prone to sickness, to whatever extent we have our health at the moment, it's not fixed, that is it. We have bodies that are vulnerable, ultimately. So we're prone to sickness. And of course that awareness of our own and others' mortality, this is really baked into being a human being. Sometimes when people hear this aspect of the Buddha's teachings, they think, this is really pessimistic and it's all about, kind of bringing us down. But actually, I think it's a huge relief, to put it very bluntly, that life just is tough. Sometimes, at least. It's part of life that it's like that. Because that is liberating from the idea that it shouldn't be like this, or for somebody else it's different. And particularly this is one of the things that can be hard, can't it, in an age of social media. It's easy to look at someone else's life and imagine that it's all smooth and wonderful. Here's a picture of me receiving an award, and here's a picture of me on holiday in the Bahamas, and here's a picture of me smiling with the family, and here's a picture of my new bathroom. I mean, we can all do that. We can give the edited highlights of our life, of all the ups. But of course, people can also share things that are more vulnerable. But whether it's that or in our imagination, the idea that, for someone else or some other time, everything's going to be smooth and easy. And even in our own life, it's easy to project that into the future, isn't it? Just around the corner is when I'll have completely arrived. For me, it was going to be the summer of 2016. I had a lot on, by the summer, everything would be all right. And life continued after that. So there's this feeling of the inevitable pains and difficulties of life, but then also the additional struggle and suffering that our minds can create. And of course that's the part that our practice is really releasing and softening. Yeah? So that's the struggle that's born of the sense of being separate, or an illusory sense of lack, of feeling kind of isolated, or feeling that this is a world where we can only relate to others in terms of threat or bargaining. All of these things kind of create a kind of separate, isolated sense of self. I think it's interesting also when we reflect on this to sort of, and this has changed for me over time, as I said, how much we interpret this teaching as about change and how much we interpret it as being about acceptance. And to give you the headline, I think it's both, but how you hold that, or what we might call a creative dynamic between change and acceptance. Because sometimes if we emphasize that first aspect around suffering, this teaching really is about saying, life is tough a lot of the time. This is really part of life. And so, but there is a freedom in really accepting that, being with that. It's okay, these are the limitations, and we can be with that. It's okay. You can see there's a letting go of resistance to that. And then there's also other times when there might be much more of an emphasis on change and transformation and how the mind can be trained, and our states of mind can be much more still and gathered. We can see more clearly. We can live with much more friendliness and compassion, and life can be very different. And so you also get that kind of teaching too. And as I said, I mean, my feeling over the years is that, of course, it's both. And this echoes the psychologist Carl Rogers, when he said it's only when I could really accept myself as I am that I was free to change. Mm-hmm. And you can feel that in the practice today when we stop resisting the thoughts that are arising. Very often they begin to settle. When we make peace with the pains, aches and pains in the body, again, there's more freedom around them. One thing, again, I encourage you to see this as a dynamic reflection, for all of us. But one thing I think for me that I have explored over the years is what my mind does with an idea like the end of suffering, which you do find in the teaching. What does that really mean? Because when you really reflect on it, there are some curiosities around it. Maybe I can share with you. I mean, one is that if you imagine two people watching the news and there was something about a situation of great pain or injustice on the news, and you had two people and one person was, really quite upset and moved around that. So, this is awful. And the other person just kind of sat there blankly and said, it's, nothing to do with me, I'm perfectly still. I mean, actually, the person who said that, you'd think is a bit cut off, and well, not more than a bit cut off. That would be really quite pathological to be like that. But there's a certain sense in which that person's suffering less than the person who's moved by that. Obviously, it depends on what we mean. Yeah. So the suffering that ends, in my understanding, is the suffering of separation, of the illusion of being isolated, disconnected. But the heart that can really quiver, with what arises in the world, that continues to be moved, as we practice. In fact, we may feel that even more deeply. I also, again, reflecting on how people who practice for many years and decades as well can also really continue in quite marked ways to have struggles in their life. And I was very moved. I haven't read that much about it actually, but it's something I'd like to look into more by the teacher Adyashanti. I don't know if you know many people, but a wonderful teacher who quite recently decided to retire and has written a very honest and open sense of his struggles with post-traumatic stress. And again, I think really holding that with a lot of wisdom and saying, now it's time for him to stop teaching. But I was reading again some of the comments that you see online about that, and it does raise questions for practitioners and people saying, I wanted the end of suffering, and what's happening here? And I don't, by the way, have very particular answers for you here, really, but it's just that feeling of continuing to live with that as a question. Where do we feel this practice is leading us, and what's real, what might be a kind of fantasy of a completely smooth and easy life forever. One of my famous Dharma books, favourite Dharma books, is by Barry Magid, who's also a psychoanalyst as well as a Zen teacher, and his book is called Ending the Pursuit of Happiness, which is a fascinating title, isn't it? See, because you might think, we're not ending the pursuit of happiness, we're just pursuing it in a wiser way, which is also another way we could see our path. But it's interesting, isn't it? What does he mean by that? What's being ended? And for him, again, he would call it a curative fantasy. But it is, I think, ending the pursuit of finding some kind of place where we think, I've finally landed now and everything is smooth and wonderful forever. That it's actually letting go of that illusion that there's a different kind of freedom that's there. So these are all reflections on what we might mean by right or wise view, and then, again, that of course can go in many, many different directions. It's just the taste of some of the things that are there. And the second element of the path is called right or wise intention. And I like to see this as a kind of bridge between what we've just been talking about, how we see the world, and what comes afterwards, which are the more active elements of speech and action and livelihood. So these really, in my understanding, are the intentions that make sense when we're seeing clearly. The intentions that make sense when we're seeing clearly. So if you're really thinking, here we are, who knows how long we've got in this life to be here, in this world, and what really matters? How do I really want to live? I don't want to be caught up in that which is trivial, superficial, doesn't, what's really important? So when we do that, of course, different things may come up, but intentions around being friendly, being compassionate, letting go, these may well arise, which are around these right intentions. Interestingly, it's phrased in terms of, the actual word is translated as non-ill will. That's one of the intentions, and another is harmlessness. And some scholars and teachers think there's something significant in that negative formulation. I mean negative in terms of the language. So rather than saying friendliness or love or kindness, it says non-ill will. Rather than saying compassion, this kind of not being harmless. But it's interesting. Often I've used them interchangeably. But it's when that sense of ill will, any wish to harm others, that's falling away, and what's left? A way of relating to the world with an open heart. And then this wonderful word in Pali is nekama, or renunciation. And often, I think, I don't know whether sometimes completely consciously, others less so, when you hear teachers these days talk about letting go, I think we could say letting go is a kind of contemporary version of renunciation. What does it feel like, renunciation? I've quite literally had this experience, by the way. If you're waiting for a bus and you've got a heavy bag on your back, you're feeling a bit uncomfortable. And then after a while you realise, I don't need to have this bag on my back. I can take it off, and the 5 minutes waiting for a bus will be much less comfortable. And it's like, I don't need to do that. And you put it down. I think that's renunciation. And that feeling of lightness in that way, it's incredibly important to see the difference between renunciation and deprivation. They're completely different. Deprivation is the idea that there's something that would make me really happy. If I had that, I would be really happy, but either I can't have it or I shouldn't have it. There's a lot of struggle in that, isn't there? It would make me really happy and I shouldn't have it. Renunciation is, I just don't need to do that. It's a relief. And you might find that in all kinds of areas in your life. I think some people find it if they've been maybe excessively, or they come to feel that they've been excessively ambitious or excessively driven. I need to do this, I need to be more successful, I need to get to that level, I need to do this, to do that. And sometimes people have a kind of moment, I don't need to do that, it's just stressing me out. Or, yeah. It certainly could be a moment when, I think I've probably got to this place with with cameras, really. I'm not going to tell you how many, but I have an embarrassing number of cameras for a Dharma teacher, really, you know. But I've definitely got to that moment. I don't need another camera, you know. There's that feeling you get kind of hooked into that. And I think also for those of us interested in the Buddha's teachings, even again, as far as I can see, you know, we're not nuns and monks here. There's something in the beauty of the lifestyle of a nun or a monk, the monastics, that can be a real inspiration for us, I think. And you know, as you can see, this is not a lifestyle I've chosen. But I think sometimes, I mean, again, I don't want to generalise, but if you might ask some people, you know, would you like to be a monastic? They might say, no, definitely not. You know, all of the good things in life, oh, you can't drive around in all these fast cars, and you can't buy loads of stuff, and you can't have a bigger and better house, and you can't play loud music, and can't have sex, and it's just totally miserable. Why would anybody want to do that? You know, and some people might have that thought. But actually, in your heart, when you start to feel the beauty of renunciation and the lightness of that, there can be an appreciation of that monastic lifestyle. Even if we're never going to do it, it's like there might be a little bit of us that's like our inner monastic. And I think it is skillful, actually, to reflect on how we feel about that kind of lifestyle. I think, again, it embodies something. Just the thought, that could be a really happy life. There's a lot of clues around that to how we can live. So we've got these views leading to this wise or right or wise intentions, and then they start to really show up in the world in how we speak. This is right speech, right action, right livelihood, the next three elements of the path. And traditionally, right speech or wise speech is about refraining from speech that is false, divisive, harsh, or meaningless. Yeah? So we're not saying things that are not true. You know, divisive is obviously speech that's talking about some other group or some other person in a way that's kind of creating that kind of disharmony. You know, harsh speech would be very, really swearing at another person or being, very directly insulting. And meaningless speech would be to just keep an endless kind of chatter in a way that means nothing really heartfelt can be said, that kind of blocks the space, for more heartfelt speech. Now, I've always loved that teaching on right and wise speech, and there is an and for me. I sometimes think, but what about when life is really tough? Because right now, when I'm talking to you, I mean, to be honest with you, I've had a lovely day. I feel quite relaxed. I'm with nice people. It's okay. But what about, when life is really difficult? Right or wise speech is a real challenge, and I do feel that, again, like I said, every moment is like that. Life keeps asking us this question: what is wise speech in this moment? Some years ago, now it's about 10 years ago, my wife was just setting up a yoga studio, and I was supporting her to do that as well. And just after we'd set up, there was some people who had rented the space above us. They also had a lovely idea of what they wanted to use their space for, but this was renting it out to the local bands to practice with the guitars and drums and everything, and support local musicians. Again, it was a lovely intention, and we had a lovely intention, but as you can imagine, they didn't work very well together. And anyway, I wish I could tell you, and the perfectly wise and easy way of dealing with this was. But really my point was more, actually, that what we were living with them was, what is wise speech here? Because, clearly if we're going to if we're going to run this, it's not, I mean, if there's noise in one meditation practice, of course you work with it and mindfully noticing it, but it will really interfere with what we were wanting to do. And of course, situations like that, and this stands in for many situations we might have all had in family, work, other situations. The general stress level of both us and the other people, everything gets high, everything's more heightened. It's tough, isn't it? What to do? And, my feeling is then life is like, well, when do we speak up? When do we speak really strongly? When do we let something go and say, actually, this time I'm just going to not say anything, So I think that wise speech can sometimes be, I need to really say something here. And sometimes wise speech is like, now is the time to stay silent. Yeah. And I wish I could tell you there's a magic formula for saying which is which. I think this is where we need mindfulness and wisdom and other ways to help us, and good friends and things. Yeah. There's a teaching from mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, that again I really love about this. I found really helpful, and sometimes it's demonstrated using hands. I don't know if you've seen this before, but one view is that you can demonstrate different speech patterns with hands. So somebody comes in and one pattern is at this person, and that's it, okay? So this person comes in, it's gone. Another thing that demonstrates another form of communication is this person comes in and this person comes back, and then this person comes back, and this person comes back, and this person comes back, yeah? So you may not know the content of what I'm saying, but you can probably get the feeling around that, So if I go back to the situation I was describing, we need this place for band practice. Okay, and that would be, that's okay, we'll put up with it. We need this space for band practice. We need it for yoga. No, we need it for band practice. No. You've probably known those situations. But what they say in MBSR is that there's this third possibility where it kind of looks like this. This one comes in, and then, and then it goes over here. And then before you know it, you're into a dance. And the dance is one of both kind of strength and yielding. And this is important to me. And you look at it like that. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, we can take some of that on board. But this is also matters to us. How does that sound for you? Maybe we can move that over there. Would that be all right? So you're into some kind of creative dance with it. But I don't know about you, but I find just that thing with the hands, again, very powerful. It's a sort of image of what wise speech might be. Again, those of you who know the classic trainings on assertiveness, this is, again, neither passive nor aggressive. It's a fluid, responsive movement. I love how Stephen Batchelor is talking about wise speech these days as finding your own voice. That's a really nice way, isn't it, as well, to kind of sum up what some of this might mean. The capacity to really find our own voice. I also deeply appreciate Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, which really emphasizes the significance of deep listening. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that the traditional teaching spoke about right speech. It didn't explicitly name right listening in the Eightfold Path, but we can really see it's there too. I don't know how many of you have seen, but there's some lovely things on the walls in this school here. And in one of the classrooms, there's actually some. Basically, they're instructing the kids on wise listening. It's lovely. It says, keep your feet on the floor, look at each other, listen deeply. For primary school kids, it's great. But this is, again, when you start to see the Eightfold Path, how it's all linked. Because how do we listen deeply? Again, many things we could say about that. But one of the things that really supports us is mindfulness of body. So everything we've been doing today, feeling the feet on the ground, feeling the seat, being aware of the breath. If you're have some contact with that, some contact with your own experience. It's much easier to really listen deeply to others, not just to what they're saying, but maybe to how they're feeling. That gives you a really good chance of saying something helpful. I'll give you a good example. Somebody is distressed with you and they say to you, "You never help me out." What's wise listening there? Or wise response? I'll tell you an unwise response is, "It's not true that I never help you." Remember this, that and the other. Because you're listening underneath that. So underneath that is a frustration. You see that, but that takes some mindfulness to do that, because if we've lost contact with ourselves, you just feel the unfairness of the accusation and respond back. "I do help you out." Okay. So you're kind of hearing the feeling beneath it. So then there's wise speech. Then that flows into the next element of the path, which is wise action. And some of you may know, again, often we speak about this in terms of the 5 precepts, to refrain from harming or killing living beings, taking that which is not given, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, or intoxicants. But again, as we think about this, again, over the many, many years I've thought about this, the way Thich Nhat Hanh uses this with his 5 mindfulness trainings, again, turn this into an ongoing contemplation, and that's a whole thing you can look at if you haven't done that before. But just to mention a couple of the ways in which that expands these, is that in Thich Nhat Hanh's version of them, they always start with aware of the suffering caused by. Aware of the suffering caused by. So the ethics then are never just kind of independent rules, but they're always based on a sensitivity to the suffering and harm caused by unwise actions. And then, beyond just this thing, I undertake to refrain from harming living beings. Thich Nhat Hanh said, what's the value under that is reverence for life. Reverence for life. And how these can become a wider contemplation for all of us. A lot of the suffering or harm that we may cause these days is indirect, isn't it? Through our patterns of consumption. It's not necessarily directly harming a person in front of us, but for instance, if we're over-consuming, there's causing suffering to others, to the planet. Another very creative way he expands these precepts. I'm just giving you a couple of examples of these. He does them with all of them. But it's with the 5th one, which is traditionally about refraining from alcohol and drugs that cloud the mind. But Thich Nhat Hanh widens that to everything that we take in. And this again can be a whole area that you can practice with. What do I take in? What comes in? And what effect does that have on the heart and the mind? And when you start to become more and more sensitive with that, you can also make more and more choices around that. So there's certain TV programs, for instance, you might notice the effect that they have on the mind. I don't know if you've watched The Wire, but The Wire, apparently is very good in its own. I'm not criticising the program, but it's a very gritty drama, if you're not familiar with it. But I remember when I was watching The Wire a lot, and I started to see just sort of kids on bikes around my area. I was like, well, what are these kids up to? They're just going for a ride on the bike, right? But my mind was being shaped by, what I was seeing on the program is a very, very harsh world that's being presented there. Yeah. So I'm not saying never to watch something like that. Again, it's an insight into a life that's different to mine. But the thing is just you start to notice just how sensitive we are as human beings to what we take in. So if we are, another example, if we're watching news 24 hours a day, what effect does that have on the mind? You start to make choices. What's a wise amount to take in? How do we stay informed without being overwhelmed and getting these kind of balances right? Yeah. And then we come to wise livelihood, which again traditionally is very often about avoiding livelihoods that are intrinsically harmful. You know, the kind of things that people might do that are harming living beings. And we can reflect on this again in so many different ways. One of them, for me, is about having a wise amount of work in our life. And by the way, this is maybe paid work or unpaid work. It might be formal or informal. Say if you're retired, this is still something relevant. You know, what are the projects we engage in? What are the tasks and activities that we do? And there's definitely a balance there in terms of not too much, not too little. Yeah? That again, we can really start to discern, I think, as part of our path. When people feel overworked, of course, that affects so many things, but also when there's a feeling there's not enough happening, that can be there too. In English, we have all of these different words, again, that I think can sum up different ways we might feel around work. Something's a chore. Yeah? This is my job. I have a career. I found my vocation. You know, there's actually just the subtlety of all of those, isn't there? How we relate to that. You know, it might be a chore, obviously, just something I've got to do, get out of the way. The job maybe is more of a means to an end. It may be something that we feel is very meaningful to us, unfolding over time, or even, you know, really central to what our life is all about. I love also the feeling that this is just as much about how we do our work rather than what we do. I think this is really important. It's not saying that everybody needs to do some kind of job that is very, you know, explicitly kind of Dharma job, whatever that might mean, or some sort of caring job. But there are many, many different, you know, whatever our work is, what is it that really infuses it with a sense of service, with a sense of care? We put our heart into it. What allows us to feel that it really matters? You know, a simple example that I've thought about for years is, again, if you're working in a shop, you can see even very small moments of interaction with a customer, something that might be really significant for that person. Maybe not really seen anyone else that day. That's where whenever I get the choice, I avoid the self-checkout tills. You know, I don't get that moment. So how are you? You know, or whatever. And I don't underestimate the cumulative effect of those small moments, to be honest. Yeah. So this is again, how do we express our path in terms of our projects, activities, tasks? Bhante Gunaratna also talks about wise livelihood in terms of looking at the effect of it on your states of mind. So there may be certain things that, you know, in other ways feel really good, but they're so agitating for the mind. It feels like they're not so skillful to do. And then we come to the last three elements of the path. So there's wise effort. Wise effort is about the effort to respond to wholesome and unwholesome states of mind that are around. Wholesome and unwholesome. Yeah, so technically there are four of them. We can develop wholesome states that haven't yet arisen and sustain the ones that already have. We can prevent the arising of unwholesome states. And we can let go of and abandon unwholesome states that are there. So that's how it is technically. But what does that mean? Well, wholesome and unwholesome are really to do with whether greed, hatred and delusion are present. So an unwholesome state is one that's shaped by greed, hatred and delusion. Again, just to share how I've been with this over the years, is I feel that there's a certain amount of care that's needed to hold this language skillfully. About particularly, the language of unwholesome, for instance. Because sometimes, if I speak personally, when I'm in an unwholesome state, or what might technically be an unwholesome state, I'm also struggling. Something's difficult. So we might also call that a vulnerable state, a state where there's some distress. But that's actually really helpful because it gives a very helpful clue as to what heals that. Because if you grasp in an unwise way this language of unwholesome, it's like I'm here. Let's say I'm here and I'm feeling incredibly angry about my boss when I'm trying to meditate, and then another part of my mind comes in like a club and says this is an unwholesome state of mind, like a sort of Buddhist superego trying to crash it. And then if you notice all the assumptions there, it's like this is something that shouldn't be here, this is something that's a personal flaw, this is something that's a problem, like that. And the kind of ill will and aversion that's then being added to that is really unhelpful. But if we think of that other language, this is, part of me that's feeling vulnerable or distressed, a part of me that then needs to be listened to. You actually find this is the way to really heal so-called unwholesome states. Yeah? And this is where you get all these practices. Many of you may have done them, like, placing a hand on the heart. May I be kind to myself in the midst of this? Or practices of feeling underneath the storyline and sensing how the body is, bringing metta to that, friendliness to that. The Buddha says hatred never ceases through hatred, but through love alone does hatred cease. And that applies to ourselves. So it's not... Again, this is just some kind of creativity and care with language here, And I've, again, noticed a lot over the years the parallel between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal. Sounds a bit technical. In other words, how we are with others and how we are with ourselves. So if you notice someone else who's maybe very kind of angry or anxious or distressed, and how unhelpful it is to simply say, there's nothing to worry about, or calm down, or you're making too much of this. All of those kind of responses kind of make the person feel even stronger, don't they? It's because that hurt part is not being listened to, so it just gets louder. But, whether we say these words directly, but, I can kind of sense the distress there. To feel that, to empathise with that. And that bit, in my understanding, always needs to come before any feeling of challenge. Yeah? I'm going to give you a very practical example of this. Let's say you're in a time something difficult's happened, and you notice the thoughts are in the mind like this is a complete nightmare. I don't think it's very helpful just to say, no, this isn't a complete nightmare. You're making too much of it. Because that's on the cognitive level. You have to get to the embodied level. And on an embodied level, that's how it feels. So when that's felt and sensed and met with friendliness, with compassion, with metta, once that's there, then the whole system begins to calm and settle, feel more grounded. And then you can say, maybe it's really difficult, but not a complete nightmare. That makes sense. So that bit's important, but it comes afterwards. It comes after the understanding. And I really do feel wise effort as being like this. So just as we might be met and soothed and understood by another person's caring or warm presence can really help us in times of distress. In our practice, we learn to do that with our more difficult states that arise. And then the last two, so then there is mindfulness, sati, this capacity to really meet our experience with an awareness that's infused with friendliness and curiosity, as we've been practicing today. And over the years of reflecting on the different roles of mindfulness that it plays. Mindfulness is a very protective quality in our lives. It really helps us to navigate difficult times, difficult experiences. And how it also helps us to see things in a new way. Sometimes said mindfulness helps us to reframe cognition. There's a very academic paper called The Mechanisms of Mindfulness that talks about how it leads to cognitive, emotional and behavioural flexibility. So I really love this academic language, cognitive, emotional, behavioural flexibility, because when you think about that, you could read it in an academic paper and think, oh, that's interesting. But when you stop and think about what that really means, it means mindfulness is completely life-changing. Because cognitive flexibility, you can take different perspectives, you can see things in different ways. You're not stuck in a fixed way of understanding things. This is hugely significant in life. And you might reflect in times of life when, particularly maybe when you feel very overwhelmed or when you're feeling very low, the cognitions go the opposite way. They become more inflexible, more intransigent, more fixed, more black and white. It's definitely like this. I'm sure they've done that. There's no other possibility. Cognitive flexibility is saying, who knows? I don't know how it is. What's another way of seeing this, another way of looking at this? Emotional flexibility means I think we can feel emotions very deeply, but maybe they don't linger so long. They're more adaptive. They're not so stuck at times. And behavioural flexibility, again, very skillful. So we can relate to wise action, that we're not just stuck in old habitual ways of dealing with things. I like to again think of this in very everyday examples. If you think of friends of yours, you might notice certain friends who you might think very regularly complain about something. Yeah? So if you were going for a meal with some friends, let's say you had 6 friends, and you think, well, one of these friends is going to complain about the food, you might know in advance which one is most likely to do that. Now, I don't mean it's judgmental. Yeah? And there might be another friend who you know the food could come out completely stone cold and inedible, and they wouldn't say anything. But what I find really interesting here is this idea that our practice can make us more flexible, behavioural flexibility. So if we're a person who habitually complains, we might learn sometimes to say, it's okay, it's not quite what I wanted, but that's all right. Still have a nice time with my friends. And if we're a person who picked up the idea when we were very young, you must never complain about something, you might discover the ability to say, oh, this is not okay. Can I change this? But again, that sounds like a small thing, but in life, it's a huge thing. We're more fluid, more flexible, more responsive. Get back to that meaning of, is it right or wise or appropriate? Our responses become more appropriate, more what really helps in any given situation, not just an old pattern. Whether it's an old pattern of passivity or aggression or whatever, or complaining or not complaining, but there's more of a dance, yeah. And that, that's really significant, as I said. We're a greater capacity to be silent and a greater capacity to speak out, both. And the final factor of the path is wise samadhi, going straight to the Pali here, often translated as concentration, although almost nobody thinks that's particularly helpful, but it stuck, I think, 100 years ago, so that's what we have. But this kind of gathering, collecting, unifying, stilling of the mind. And again, of course, for many people this can become a whole path and practice, and including, sense of great brightness in the mind, sukha, ease in the mind, or piti, a kind of rapture in the body, brightness in the mind. One thing I just wanted to say about that, and again, of course, that could be not just a whole talk, but several talks, is to reflect on what it means for that to be right or wise, and whether there's such a thing as unwise concentration or unwise samadhi, but how we use that in our practice. And for me, this is work in progress, so please don't hold me to it if I say something different next year. But at the moment, I think what really draws my heart is more the feeling of the sustainability of a degree of samadhi. So sometimes in life you can get really interested in the subtlety. You go on lots of really long retreats and deep silence and hours a day. There's a wonderful beauty in that. And there's also the sense of, well, what does samadhi mean in everyday life? And there's certainly many teachers who say, if we expand the time of our daily practice, we might be really quite surprised at how much samadhi there is in everyday life. But for me, it's that feeling of something that is a real refuge, And I say that because I notice the times when the samadhi is weakest, the times of, as I said, great overwhelm and things. It's difficult because, one, I'm suffering more, and two, I'm less helpful for others. So you can see then why samadhi is one. Yeah, there's just less suffering being created in those moments, and also it really feeds the other elements of the path. With wise samadhi we can see more clearly. We're more likely to find a wise and appropriate action. And again, really strong links with wise speech. The more samadhi there is, the more chance there is of the speech being kind and wise and harmonious. But interestingly, the more wise our speech is, the more calm the mind is, right? You notice these interactions both ways. You say something that's not so helpful, you can feel it playing on the mind for a long time afterwards. So, this is what I wanted to share, on these 8 elements that really support each other. But I've been speaking of them separately, but again, just reflecting of them together. They're 8 parts of a beautiful way to live, really. And they're really helpful to have them as a practice, to keep coming back. What do they mean now? What does wise samadhi mean for me now? It's wise speech, wise action, and to use them, again, not as kind of somebody else's answers to what they are, but as reflections in our life.